Hi guys, you're watching Railways Explained. Today we are talking about the construction of the well-known Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. As it was originally known, the Pacific Railroad, or later the Overland Route, the Transcontinental Railroad was a 1,912 miles long, continuous railroad line constructed between 1863 and 1869 that connected the existing Eastern U.S. rail network at Council Bluffs in Iowa with the Pacific Coast at the Oakland Long Wharf on San Francisco Bay. And yes, it was constructed in only 7 years. United States, as it is today, exists because of the railroads. Railroads were the factor that united the country and stimulated economic development that soon after enabled the country to become the world's richest nation. The railroads also transformed American society, changing it from primarily agrarian economy to an industrial powerhouse within only a few decades of the 19th century. Quite simply, without the railroads, the United States would have not become the United States and would remain a group of divided states, or at least for a while. According to Henry Brents, a professor of history at University of Texas at Austin, the American Constitution was designed to provide a legal framework for a single national market. But the Transcontinental Railroad provided the physical framework that was missing. These frameworks gave the United States the single largest market in the world, which provided the basis for the rapid expansion of American industry and agriculture to the point where the United States by the 1890s had the most powerful economy on the planet. The world's first significant railroads have been developed in Britain in the third decade of the 19th century, and several European countries had quickly followed this trend. The United States soon after joined the game and became the world's leader according to railroad mileage. The railroad age was born and nothing could stop it, bearing in mind that lots of American businessmen saw the railroad as a great opportunity for making profits. The American railroad mania began in 1830 when Peter Cooper's locomotive, called the Tom Thumb, was put into service and traveled 13 miles along what would later become known as the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Line. Over 1,200 miles of railroad tracks were laid down between 1832 and 1837. By 1850, about 9,000 miles of rail tracks were built in the east part of the Missouri River. During that same period, the first settlers began to move westward across the United States. This trend increased dramatically after the annexation of California following the Mexican-American War, the discovery of gold in the region in 1848, and the statehood of California in 1850. Which further spurred the interest to unite the country as thousands of immigrants and miners sought their fortune in the West. For these people who decided to move west, traveling by land across the continent was very risky and almost impossible, given the complexity of the terrain, which consists of mountains, plains, rivers and deserts with practically no roads. Instead, westward migrants chose to travel by sea, taking the 6-month route across the Cape Horn, or risking yellow fever or other diseases by crossing the Isthmus of Panama and traveling via ship to San Francisco. The first idea of a railroad connecting the east and the west coast had first been mentioned as early as 1820, but it was not until 1845 that the idea was seriously considered and discussed. In 1845, the New York entrepreneur Asa Whitney presented a resolution in Congress proposing the federal funding of a railroad that would stretch to the Pacific. In June 1845, he led a team of engineers and people with railroad experience along the part of the proposed route to assess its feasibility. Legislation to begin construction of the Pacific Railroad, called the Memorial of Asa Whitney, was first introduced to Congress by Representative Zadok Pratt, but Congress did not immediately act on Whitney's proposal. Due to the Civil War, this idea was postponed, mostly because during that time it was at least the most ambitious railroad project in the whole world. During the 1850s, Congress sponsored numerous surveys to investigate possible routes for a transcontinental railroad. No particular route became a clear favorite as political groups were split over the decision of whether the route should go over the north or the south. Theodore Judah, a civil engineer who helped build the first railroad in California, promoted a route along the 41st parallel, running through Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and California. He was so obsessed with the idea of a transcontinental railroad that he became known as the Crazy Judah. This young engineer also identified an old immigrant route via infamous Donner Pass in Northern California, where a group of westward immigrants became trapped in 1846 as an ideal location for constructing a railroad through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. By 1861, Judah had enlisted a group of investors in Sacramento to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company. After that, he went to Washington, where he tried to convince the leaders of Congress and President Abraham Lincoln himself. Many congressmen were leery of beginning such an expensive venture, especially with the Civil War underway, but President Lincoln, who was a longtime supporter of railroads, finally agreed with Judah. In 1862, Congress passed the so-called Pacific Railroad Bill, as well as several financial grants that allowed support for the companies that should be involved in the construction. These companies are mostly Central Pacific and Union Pacific. Western Pacific was also involved, which was supposed to connect the Transcontinental Railroad with the terminal in the Pacific. While the Central Pacific started works on January 8, 1863, the Union Pacific did not start construction for another 18 months. These works were delayed due to difficulties in obtaining financial backing and the unavailability of the materials due to the Civil War. However, for the Central Pacific, the most difficult task was finding workers. Laborers, mainly Irish immigrants, were hired in New York and Boston and then shipped out west, which came at great expense. Then many workers abandoned work on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in order to go work in Nevada silver mines. In desperation, Central Pacific tried to hire newly freed African Americans, immigrants from Mexico, and even petitioned Congress to send 5,000 Confederate Civil War prisoners, but to no avail. Frustrated at the lack of manpower necessary to support the railroad, this company was about to hire Chinese laborers. At first, they hired only 50 men, but after only 1 month, they became convinced that the Chinese workers were responsible, sober, and hard-working, and in the end, their number went up to 15,000. Within 3 years, 80% of the Central Pacific workforce was made up of Chinese workers. They proved to be essential to the task, especially of laying the line through the extremely hard terrain of Sierra Nevada. Once believed to be too frail to perform arduous manual labor, Chinese workers indeed accomplished amazing and dangerous feats no other workers would do. They blasted tunnels through the solid granite, sometimes progressing only a foot a day. According to some sources, they even often lived in tunnels, saving precious time and energy. While the Central Pacific fought punishing conditions moving eastward through mountains, across ravines, and through blizzards, the Union Pacific faced resistance from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes who were seeing their homelands invaded and irrevocably changed. The railroad workers were armed and oftentimes protected by U.S. cavalry and friendly Pawnee Indians, but the workforce routinely faced Native American raiding parties that attacked surveyors and workers, stole livestock and equipment, and pulled up track and derailed locomotives. The successful design of bridges, pillars, and tunnels along the transcontinental route was critical for the railroad to function. Construction crews built these structures as they worked ahead of the track layers. They crossed rivers, canyons, mountains, and dry gullies that would wash with water during rain or spring snow melt. Engineers of both railroads faced dangers and endured environmental extremes on a scale that no railroad builder had yet faced. For example, Central Pacific had the task of building 15 tunnels, while the Union Pacific built only 4. One tunnel alone, the infamous Summit Tunnel built by Central Pacific, then known as the Tunnel No. 6, was at an elevation of 7,000 feet, and was the longest tunnel built at the time, cutting through approximately 1,750 feet of solid granite. Workers used hammers and chisels to pick away at the stone, progressing little more than 1 foot per day, despite hour after hour of work. The excavation rate increased to nearly 2 feet per day when workers started using nitroglycerin to blast away some rock. This amazing railway project was finished on May 10, 1869, when the Union Pacific met the Central Pacific on the territory of the state of Utah. Namely, by early 1869, the companies were performing works that were only a few miles away. In March, the newly inaugurated President Ulysses S. Grant announced that he would withdraw federal funds until the two companies agree on a meeting point. The decision had fallen on Promontory Summit north of the Great Salt Lake, some 690 track miles from Sacramento and 1,086 miles from Omaha. On May 10th, after several delays, a crowd of workers and dignitaries watched as the final spike was driven by linking the Central Pacific and Union Pacific in the Golden Spike ceremony. The Golden Spike was made of 17.6 karat gold, but was subsequently removed after the ceremony and replaced with traditional iron spike. This Golden Spike is now part of the Stanford University collection. And yet, when the last spike was driven, the rail network was not yet connected to the Atlantic or Pacific. It merely connected Omaha and Sacramento. To get from Sacramento to the Pacific, the Central Pacific purchased in 1867 the struggling Western Pacific. In February 1868, the construction was resumed after halting in October 1866 due to funding troubles. On November 8, 1869, the Central Pacific finally completed the rail connection all the way to the western terminus at Oakland, California, but also on the East Bay, where freight and passengers completed their transcontinental journey to San Francisco by ferry. In the end, Central Pacific constructed 690 miles of tracks, Union Pacific 1,085 miles, and Western Pacific 132 miles. It's good to mention that the Transcontinental Railroad would not have been built without the public subsidies, but also without the granting of land, and more importantly, the loans from the federal government. One of the reasons was the fact that at the time there were no businesses in the western part of America strong enough to support a project of this caliber. To finance the project, an act authorized the federal government to issue 30-year US government bonds with 6% interest. The railroad companies were paid $16,000 per mile of laid track on a level grade, which is approximately $461,000 today, $32,000 per mile of track laid in foothills, which is about $922,000, and $48,000 per mile of track laid in the mountains, which is almost $1.4 million in today's values. Keep in mind that California was sort of isolated state at the time. It was a state with large cities on the coast, but largely separated from the United States by vast areas of empty land. There were thousands of miles of mountain ranges and plains with no reliable transportation connections. This caused the cities of the East to be practically disconnected from the cities of the West. In the 1840s, there were 3 ways to travel between the East and the West coast of the United States, and none of them was easy. First was direct way overland by wagon, running the risk of attacks by bandits and not other, which took almost 6 months and $1,000 between, for example, California and New York. For the reference, after the railroad was completed, it took only 1 week and only $150. Second and third way of travel is scary even to mention. Imagine taking a ship and traveling via dangerous waters of Cape Horn all the way south around the South America and then all the way north up to the west coast. The third possible way was also taking the ship down the east coast of the United States, but then taking a 50-mile long hike through the dangerous jungles of Panama, and then up north all the way to the desired destination. The introduction of a rail network not only shortened the length of the passenger trips coast to coast, it also shortened the time needed for the transport of goods, and, more importantly, it expanded available markets. That had a twofold effect on the US economy. The sellers found new markets to sell their goods, and individuals who lived on the frontier were able to obtain goods that had previously been unavailable or extremely difficult to find. Within only 10 years of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, trains for shipping the freight worth of approximately $50 million from coast to coast every year. As a result, a production boom occurred, thus speeding up the process of comprehensive economic development and enabling more and more people to start businesses and offer their products in previously remote and disconnected areas. On June 4, 1876, an express train called the Transcontinental Express arrived in San Francisco via the first Transcontinental Railroad, only 83 hours and 39 minutes after it left New York City. It's important to mention that despite the benefits it brought to the US, the Transcontinental Railroad also had some negative consequences. Among most significant was forced relocation of Native Americans from their lands, which in some places resulted in the destruction of their culture and their specific way of life. Many conflicts arose as the railroad continued, even requiring the intervention of the military. In addition, many natural resources were destroyed in order to make way for the expanding tracks and rail stations. Now, when we introduced you with the both sides of the coin, you guess, was it worth it or not? This was the story about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad on Railways Explained. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new about the railways of the world. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your rail-loving friends, and of course subscribe to our channel. Also, consider becoming our patron. Until the next time, goodbye.